like weird things about you, we love to end with like weird things about people. I feel like maybe you filled that out on the form from a long time ago. Like what you'd want to be when you grew up or anything other than
I
teaching.
think you mistake my looks for trying to think of weird things. I'm thinking about which weird thing to share. There's no paucity of weird things.
Welcome to today's show, everyone. I'm Megan.
And I'm Nicole, and it's time for recess.
Today, we welcome Tiffany Hogan, one of our dear friends and great collaborators, to talk a little bit more about DLD. Hope you enjoy.
Alrighty. Welcome back. Welcome, Dr. Hogan. Thank you for being here with us this morning. Very excited to have you and really appreciate your time. Why don't you give our listeners a brief idea of who you are and what you do these days?
Great. I'm so happy to be here. It's such a fun time to get to work with you all and get to talk to you today. I'm Tiffany Hogan, and I'm a professor in communication sciences and disorders at the MGH Institute of Health Professions in Boston and a research associate at Harvard Medical School. I'm a speech language pathologist by training and was a practicing speech language pathologist before I obtained a PhD to study more thoroughly speech language connections in children and how it relates to literacy.
Thank you. So I think people are definitely familiar with your name. You're all over the map. A lot of times, often people may hear you in connection with DLD. Can you give everyone who has not an idea of what DLD is?
Yes, DLD is developmental language disorder. It is a difficulty in learning languages that a person can have in understanding or talking. This occurs in about 1 in 10 children, so it's very common, but it's unfortunately quite unknown and hidden in children. So to really determine who has DLD, you have to do a comprehensive language evaluation to see how well they're performing in their ability to use language and understand language every day.
Tiffany, 1 in 10? I mean, everyone who's anyone has been talking about dyslexia lately, and it is Dyslexia Awareness Month, so I'm grateful for that conversation. I'm engaged in tons of policy work too, and nobody's talking about this. Everyone's talking about dyslexia. So how is dyslexia and DLD related, similar, different? Because I think there's a lot of discourse on that.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, like why is DLD not more known? And I think there's a couple of reasons. I think the biggest reason is that in the past, it's had multiple labels. So it's hard to have awareness and advocacy and, knowledge about a difference when you have multiple labels. So in the past, developmental language disorder has been referred to as specific language impairment in the research literature, or language learning impairment. Terms of like DSM-5, where you look for psychological evaluation that's used by psychologists. It's referred to as expressive or receptive language disorder. It's also referred to differently depending on the age of the child, which really complicates matters because it can be referred to as a learning disability in comprehension. And in schools, we have in the US multiple labels that are used to qualify children for support services in schools. And DLD has been referred to as a developmental delay if a child is young. It's referred to more globally as a speech and language impairment or a communication disorder. It's one of the types of communication disorders or speech and language impairments that get services. So that's a referral kind of label. And it's referred to as a learning disability in comprehension later on. It's also complicated by the fact that it does have a very big overlap with dyslexia. So dyslexia and DLD overlap about 50 to 80% of the time. And so it can be really convoluted that way as well. So in 2017, there was an international consensus to recognize that DLD was not getting the advocacy it needed to and the traction around policy and support. And so this international consensus of researchers and speech language pathologists and educators decided that internationally this would be referred to as developmental language disorder. So even though it's something that had multiple labels and that you may not have heard of, it has been studied for over 100 years. It is a variation that we see, a neurodiversity in the way the brain processes language in general. We've seen this from the beginning of studying language. We see it in every language studied. So it exists. It's just had difficulty in the PR range of knowing what to call it and how to get the word out about it.
That PR range is so critical though, because I think of Nicole and how she started her career off at AIM Academy, Nicole. So that school was founded because of students with language-based learning difficulties. I'm sure you've seen some of the signs too, Nicole, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm thinking about the part of the challenge too in identifying students with DLD as opposed to students, while there is overlap with dyslexia, students who strictly have a language-based learning disability like dyslexia. We've gotten so good now at giving universal screeners, right, that are going to identify students who are at risk for reading difficulty through decoding measures, right? So I can identify a student as at risk pretty easily with a 1-minute screener, at risk, not diagnose them. Um, but is that going to how's that translate to DLD, right? Like, is there this quick pulse that we can really get a sense, oh, this student's at risk for DLD, or what's that look like?
I think that's a really important point, and something to think about in relation to what's going on with dyslexia. I'm often thinking about how there's similarities and these differences. So I think we have to almost go back to like, what is language, and thinking about, you said, Megan, language learning disabilities, because DLD is also a language learning disability, and so is dyslexia, and they're both grounded in language, but in slightly different ways, which makes it complicated. And then also the developmental trajectory matters too, because if you don't read as much, you have dyslexia early on, maybe your language is good, but you have dyslexia and you can't read words, then you aren't able to actually acquire vocabulary through text. So your language could actually go down. So it's a little complicated by that. But back to the basics about language. Language is complex in and of itself and how we develop language over time. But that complexity can go down to 3 primary components. One is the form of language, which is sounds and how we're representing language. And in spoken language, it's sounds. Of course, then sign language would be, if you're using sign language, your form is more your hand movements, your finger movements in space. But the form of spoken language is sounds. And then you have the content of that language, which is the meaning behind what you're trying to convey. And that's more associated with vocabulary or complex grammar. That's the meaning behind, we call that content. And then there's the pragmatics, or the social use of language. So pragmatically speaking, that's using language in a way, maybe your intonation will change the meaning of something, or maybe you're using it in a certain context and that means something then in another context. So you have the form of sounds, the content of the meaning, and the social use or pragmatics. What we know is that children with dyslexia have primary early difficulty in the sound representations, and in particular, binding sounds and letters together. Children with DLD have difficulty in the content area of language, so difficulty learning vocabulary and complex syntax. That's their area of difficulty. So they're both language learning difficulties, but in different areas of language. And even that example is too simplistic, because we know having difficulty processing sounds can also impact how you can tell if a word is one word or another, which could impact your vocabulary. So it is more complicated than that. But at the heart of it, dyslexia is a learning disability in connecting letters and sounds and doing so efficiently to be able to read accurately and fluently, whereas developmental language disorder is a language learning disability in your ability to learn and remember vocabulary words and complex grammar. So those are the differences, but they are highly overlapping. Now, with that base in mind, I'm often thinking about like all of this great momentum we have around dyslexia. It's fantastic. These policies and teacher training and early screening requirements, it's fantastic. However, we don't see that for DLD, but we need to see that for DLD, because DLD is the other side of what we know we need to be good at reading comprehension, which is the ultimate goal. So one is word reading, and the other is language comprehension, which is really the purview we're talking about with vocabulary and complex syntax for developmental language disorder. So back to your question about early risk. So with dyslexia, we know that you can only gauge risk in kindergarten because ultimately a child has to be taught how to read words because that's not a natural process. So you have to give them some really good instruction and give them some instruction to then know who's really has dyslexia, because in the beginning, children might score poorly on some of these risk factors because they just haven't been taught how to read. This is not the case for DLD, because for DLD, you can have really accurate diagnostic information early on in kindergarten, because what they've needed to have is exposure to oral language, and they've had that for 5 years when they come to kindergarten. And there may be a range of that exposure that they've had, but research has shown us that they only need a little bit of exposure, actually. If they're neurobiologically wired to learn language, they'll learn it. And so, you can actually have a pretty good, reliable, and accurate indication of whether a child has DLD very early on in their formal education. The problem is we don't have a system in place to get that done, because in the past, it's been speech language pathologists who've done some screening, and we really referred on teacher and parent referral. So we wait for parents and teachers to say, yeah, they're having some problems. But the issue with that is that we consistently show in research that parents and teachers are not trained or good at figuring out the indicators of DLD. So if we wait for parents and teachers, our rate of referral is so low that we're currently missing 80% of children who are struggling. So we cannot wait on teachers and parents to identify DLD because it is hidden, meaning that a child's going to give their best representation of language that they can. And so, they're going to put their best foot forward, of course, not consciously, but subconsciously. And so you're not going to be able to tell how well they do with hard language. The other thing is that it's really hard to figure out the variability in language. As a speech language pathologist for years, it's very difficult even for me to have a short conversation with a child and figure out if they have DLD. Because again, that variability is quite, high. There's a lot of range of language ability, and I'm looking for the lowest 10th percentile. So the only way to really figure that out is to actually do some testing of language. And a good example for this is vision screening. You really can't tell who has a vision difficulty by just interacting with them. You're not going to just be able to be like, oh, they're squinting. Oh, they're pulling this paper close to them. Because a lot of kids squint. A lot of kids pull papers close to them. Doesn't mean they have a vision problem. And so what we have to do is actually do a test. And then you're like, oh, I can see it now because I'm actually taxing the system. I'm making them look for really small symbols or letters, and I can see, wow, they can't see them. And children can't report to you whether they have a vision difficulty. That's not something they can do because they've only seen the world with those eyes. And so children can't tell you if they have a developmental language disorder. That's the only experience they've ever had. So we have to set up systems that screen. So screening is short, reliable. It's going to give you a little bit of information about language, and it's going to help you figure out who doesn't have a language issue and who you should kind of focus your more comprehensive evaluation on. And then we'll determine who needs support. And one last thing I'll say, I know I've been talking for a while. I could talk, 5 hours straight about this. But one thing I'll say is that we've also suffered from a silo problem. And a lot of times we have that. So these children have really been served by speech language pathologists who either come in and take them out of the classroom and do some activities with them, or they might be in the classroom for a short period of time and, facilitating language learning. But we know that's not enough dosage, that children need to have high quality language stimulation in the classroom by all of their trusted adults. So having this whole network of support for them is going to be critical. It's not just the purview of the speech language pathologist. It's got to be an interdisciplinary approach. But again, the system, unfortunately, is not set up for collaboration to support children.
This is so insightful. I remember one of your presentations we went to, you showed both of the MTSS triangles and said, we're getting really good at this one, but this is the one that we're not getting good at. And I remember in your presentation, you said, if anyone's doing this well, call you because this seems to be an area of a lot of struggle. I know that we've seen lots of different pieces coming out, a lot of different screeners coming out. Do you have any that are like your more favorite ones that you think people can lean to that are more helpful in this process of screening at risk?
Well, we have a recent paper we put out that is open access, open availability, where we review the commercially available screeners for DLD in North America, which was an English-based screeners. And even with that, we only found 15. Now there are several that have come out since, but not much more. So there's definitely a need for screeners to be created and tested in psychometrics and tested in school settings. Of those screeners, really frankly, none of them met all of the gold standards. There's a lot of improvement that is needed in language screeners, but we also put in some scenarios in that paper because I'm constantly asked, what is the best screener? But it really depends on the age of the child and the system in which you have in place. That some screeners are going to be better for your school system than others based on your age, the age of the children you're serving, the resources you have, your collaborative model, whatnot. Having said that, we do know that there are a couple key indicators of DLD that have been fleshed out in the research and also in screeners. And one is in the research primarily, although I think this is moving towards commercialization, is sentence repetition. So children with DLD have difficulty repeating sentences for multiple reasons. One is that it reveals their difficulty in vocabulary because they'll often repeat a sentence that says less specific words because they don't recall those words. They don't have them mapped into their lexicon. So they might replace a word with thing or stuff. They also will use less complex grammar when repeating the sentence. So that's something that's really showing a lot of good traction for a screener that's short. It's trickier to actually measure, but there's been a lot of great work in that as well in terms of making quick, easy scoring protocols for this. But this is not something you could just go get, homemade, ask children in your classroom to repeat sentences, because you have to have sentences that are constructed in a way that that reveals the difficulty children would have who have DLD, because we know certain sentences are harder for them than others, and certain vocabulary words are harder than others. So it has to be specifically created for that task. There's also a great work around story retell. So children with DLD have difficulty retelling cohesive stories. So they have difficulty letting you know kind of who the main character is, what's the setting, what happens first, next, and last, how does a problem present itself, what was the solution, what was the resolution. They tell incohesive stories, and that's a consistent finding. So some of the screeners are asking teachers to tell the child a story, a short story that they read to them, and then ask them to repeat it back. So it's still a retell task, but when they retell it, gives you a lot of good information about what they're recalling and how they structure stories in their mental representations and their schemas. So there's a lot of good possibilities coming out, and I've worked with teachers to give these measures. And one thing we see consistently is they say, wow, I didn't realize there was this much variability in language in my classroom, because the classroom's not really set up to be able to tell the language faculty and abilities of children consistently. And so doing these tasks, the byproduct I love is that it really helps teachers see the variability and how language is quite different. It also can tell you who is a child you have characterized as being shy. Are they truly quote unquote shy, or are they struggling to communicate what they want to tell you? And that test will help figure some of those things out, because children with DLD are often misrepresented by personality traits such as shy or hesitant. And that's on the positive, maybe more positive personality traits versus, unfortunately, negative personality traits like mischievous, unintelligent, things like that. So I think screening is really important. And I think progress monitoring as well, getting consistent language instruction, whether it's knowledge-based, all of them are knowledge-based, but really trying to think about knowledge and language coming together. But as school systems are looking to do this and educators are looking to do this, I also believe that the research and publishers need to do a better job of getting resources in the hands of educators, because right now there is not as many resources as we'd like to see to put in place a multi-tiered system of support for language learning difficulties like DLD.
I hope people will hit the rewind button there because all of that was pure gold. That was really helpful. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone lay it out so clearly. Thank you for going into those ideas and measures and how we can get a sense on this early. I love that you said that, you know, birth to 5, a lot of language is being built, so it's pretty reliable to determine the presence of DLD extremely early in comparison to, um, dyslexia. Of course, like you said, we may be waiting because you have to see if students have been taught and yada yada, but language is developing immediately, and so that really can be something that is um, tracked and caught early. And so if it is, right, if we suspect DLD or we have indicators showing that students may have DLD, what are teachers to do, right? Like what is the approach to instruction different? Is the accommodations different? What are your thoughts there?
Well, the first thing to do would be to try to coordinate with your speech language pathologist, but that's tricky too because speech language pathologists have been trained about these labels that are used in schools. So it's not uncommon for me to talk to a speech language pathologist who doesn't know much about DLD, but I'll say, yes, you do. You know everything about it. These are our kids. These are the kids we work with. And here's the labels that are being used to identify them. So if your speech language pathologist doesn't know what DLD is, that's okay. It's really a label issue. So it's just kind of connecting on this child's having difficulty using language in the classroom, and let's work together to support that child to determine if they qualify for an individualized education plan, or if they don't, what kind of supports can we give them, either or. It's a lot like dyslexia in the terms of the things that support children with DLD support all children. So we know with dyslexia that they need to have explicit systematic phonics instruction. We know that all children benefit from systematic explicit phonics. So what I'm going to tell you that supports children with developmental language disorder, that supports all children. So these strategies that help these children are strategies that are good for all children in the classroom. So some of them are, one, to break down complex instructions, because the classroom is full of complex instructions, 4-step instructions. And oftentimes the child with DLD is, after the first step, kind of looking around or looking to their peers, like what's going on? Because I can only hold on to 1 or 2 steps at a time. So breaking those down and making sure that each step is understood before going to the next one is very helpful. Pairing visual is extremely helpful because language is, it's very dynamic. It's fleeting. You say it and it's gone. Whereas a visual image, whether it's written words or a picture, that's going to be static. So that will stay there. So creating some visuals and written instructions too are very helpful. That's helpful even for the child who has dyslexia. The written instruction, even though they may have difficulty reading, having some kind of visual, even a written instruction, is very helpful for them to just have something to hang on to. Another important aspect is to educate yourself and your peers on DLD to have a better sense of the fact that these children were born with a difficulty in learning language, but they can make great improvement and they need more repetitions. So it's not that they're trying to be mischievous or trying not to understand. They're doing the very best they can. And what we have to do is provide them more dosage. So children can learn new words with 1 or 2 exposures, depending on their level of language learning. Children with DLD need many, many more exposures, depending on their severity. So they just need to hear it multiple times to really get it into their memory. And even if it's in their memory, they may need some cues to get it out. Like that word starts with, give them a sound, give them some cues to activate their memory of that word. So these are some of the strategies that can be used in the classroom. But again, these strategies work with all children.
Meg, everything Dr. Hogan just said there, I was thinking, well, this sounds familiar. Megan and I have been diving into supporting English learners, and it would make sense. They're acquiring language, strengthening language. Every single tip you just gave there would apply for them. But like you said, helps all, harms none. Like if we can make these shifts in practices to better support those students, we're not harming any of our other students by breaking down directions, pairing visuals, all of those great tips that you just gave.
Yeah, I love one of the things that really stuck with me, everyone's talking about buying curriculum and aligning curriculum. We're seeing a huge push, rightfully so, to knowledge building curriculum, but knowledge building with that language, a huge emphasis on language, not just content knowledge, seems to be something that's really missing right now. So Tiffany, I know we're involved in tons of projects together, so maybe we'll just write a curriculum in our spare time one of these days.
Love to see it. It sounds great. I did want to say one last thing about English language learners. It's a good thought, because you're right. We can use those same strategies, because the key for developmental language disorder is it's a language learning difficulty. So what this means is that for children who are English language learners, if you give them a test of language and they haven't had much English exposure, we're back to that same concept like dyslexia. Like, that's going to really underrepresent their language ability. But how we're going to determine if they have developmental language disorder is that you're going to see how they're learning language over time. So regardless of the language they're learning, whether it be English as a second language, third language, fourth language, or their first language that they learn, you're going to see that it's going to be difficult for them to learn language. And that's going to be the hallmark for English language learners that have DLD, because there's no reason, we haven't seen, to indicate that there would be any more percentage or less percentage that would have DLD in that group of children. So they're born into a situation where they're learning multiple languages, which is amazing and a superpower. But it just depends, because they may be born into that situation where they're learning multiple languages and they have a brain that makes it difficult to learn language. The flip side of that is that we never want to discourage those who have DLD from learning multiple languages. It may take them a little longer to learn multiple languages, but they can learn multiple languages. And of course, they benefit from that in terms of being able to identify with their culture, their family, make gains in their career, whatever. We know there's lots of benefits for knowing multiple languages. So we never want to discourage a child with DLD from learning multiple languages. We just want to be prepared that it'll take a little bit longer for them to learn those languages.
I'm pretty sure we cited a blog, Nicole, in our coursework with Elsa. I'm almost positive that DLD and Me site, we cited a blog about that very thing in there, because it's a huge misconception. So many misconceptions are on this. That's a huge one. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront. Dr. Hogan, how did you get so smart? How did you do this? Your whole life, you just aspired to be this great PhD scholar.
Years and years of learning. And it's funny you say that, because early on in my career, I wanted to be a psychologist, because I'm fascinated with learning, just learning in general, and human behavior and all of that. So I wanted to be a psychologist. And so my first day of undergraduate, in my first class of intro psychology, they said, well, here's the trajectory of a psychologist. And if you want to do psychology, you're likely to get a PhD. This is what it looks like, years and years and years. And I thought, I like school, but I don't like it that much. I'm gonna peace out. So I moved out of psychology because you had to get a PhD. So then I explored other options, and I ended up as a speech language pathologist. Fast forward, I'm practicing as a speech language pathologist, and I was tasked with creating this early literacy instruction program in a time when I graduated, there was actually kind of suppression of speech language pathologists working on reading. That was for special educators and educators. So I didn't have much knowledge about it. And I read the book that was in our field on it, Language and Reading Disabilities by Hugh Katz, and realized he was not far from me down the road at the University of Kansas. And I was in Kansas City. I started talking to him talking to him about what I was doing clinically. And he said, no, maybe a PhD. And I said, yeah, let's think about that. So ironically, my 18-year-old self is very surprised that I do have the PhD. It was definitely not in the cards for me. And the reason I came to it was because I first and foremost care about children and their outcomes. And I'm very curious about behavior.
It was meant to be.
I
You've
guess.
done amazing work. You continue to do amazing work. So thank you for giving us a glimpse of it today. I've learned a ton. I've really, really enjoyed listening to you.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this amazing service, getting the word out about all types of educational research and outcomes for everyone who listens to your podcast.
Thanks, Tiff. We appreciate you, and we can't wait for our next collaboration. So stay tuned. I'll see you at IDA.
Sounds
See
good.
you there. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Tiff.
Bye.
All right. That was such a fun episode. I love talking to Tiffany Hogan. She's brilliant, and we are so fortunate that she gave us some of her time today. Thinking about takeaways, something that I am definitely walking away with today is the idea that strong teachers know a great deal about language. That's the only way we're going to notice whether students have difficulties, and the only way we're going to notice which realms those difficulties are in, and how we can then use that to inform our instruction. So I'm thinking, okay, what does that mean, Nicole? Know a good deal about language. Well, they know there are 5 language systems to begin with, right? Phonology. So she talked to us about whether that could be students' articulation, whether it's them listening and repeating, um, and, forming words correctly, whether it's sounds are out of orders in word, things like that. Morphology, right? Do they apply any knowledge of morphemes? Do they drop off suffix endings? Could that be a sign? Semantics, their use of vocabulary, how strong or not is their use of language in terms of word choice, syntax, right? Do they speak in complete sentences, word order in sentences, the complexity of their sentences? And then she defined pragmatics for us, right? Using language for social purposes. So not only knowing, okay, there are 5 language systems, but listening to students speak and identifying within those 5 systems which ones are showing, signs of difficulty, and therefore how can I provide explicit instruction to target language, develop language, support language in those areas.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think what makes this so different, everyone is so hooked right now, and rightfully so on MTSS, really using those assessments and those screeners to diagnose and be very careful in their instruction. Love it. But I think there's no real shortcut to DLD. While dyslexia is really apparent in kindergarten after some instruction and we can intervene really early and close that gap, it's a bit more complicated for DLD. It's a little more complicated to diagnose, and it's a little more complicated to intervene. Like you said, all of those language systems are at play rather than just a select few. So I think one of my biggest takeaways is knowing there's no shortcuts to any place worth going. I don't know who said that, but I think it's true. And really being a language expert when you want to be a teacher. Parents and teachers are really at the forefront of the lines here to making sure these kids get what they need. So we're counting on each other and on you to make sure our kids get that language instructions. We can begin to close these gaps and help these kiddos.
If you have not listened to our episode with Dr. Cabell, I mean, this really lends nicely, right? The Strive for Five framework is all about developing language and building out language experiences. And so I can imagine that something like that would significantly help these learners as well.
Absolutely. And if you want to learn more a little bit from Dr. Hogan, she has her own website, DLD and Me. She's also the host of her own podcast, See, Hear, Speak podcast. And she's also part of a collective at FCRR, which is called the Learning Disabilities Translational Science Collective. And they have some really great resources on this as well. She did mention that open access paper that you could easily find about some of those language screeners, knowing they're not all perfect, but it really is based on your unique situation, what works best for your school system.
Excellent. I'll be checking those out. Thanks for joining us at Recess, guys. See you next time.
See ya.